The autumn leaves crunched beneath 8-year-old Danny Patterson's sneakers as he bounded down Maple Street in Columbus, Ohio, his Spider-Man backpack bouncing rhythmically against his small frame. It was October 15th, 1986, and the crisp morning air carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of another typical school day at Roosevelt Elementary. Linda Patterson watched from their front porch, coffee mug in hand, as her son turned the corner toward his usual route. She had no way of knowing that this fleeting glimpse of her child's carefree stride would become a memory she'd replay thousands of times over the next 24 years. Danny had been excited that morning, chattering endlessly about the Halloween costume contest coming up at school and his plans to dress as a superhero. His sandy brown hair caught the morning sunlight as he talked animatedly about his day ahead, his gap-toothed grin infectious as always. Frank Patterson had already left for his shift at the Honda manufacturing plant on the west side of town, but not before reminding Danny to look both ways at every intersection and to go straight to school without any detours. If you're following along with this incredible true story that shook an entire community, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers around the world who are drawn to these remarkable cases of hope against impossible odds. The Clintonville neighborhood where the Pattersons lived was the kind of place where children rode their bicycles until streetlights came on and neighbors knew each other's names. Tree-lined streets with modest two-story homes created a sense of security that made parents comfortable, letting their children walk to school alone. It was a working-class area where families had lived for generations, where front porches served as community gathering spots, and where everyone looked out for each other's children. When Danny failed to arrive at Roosevelt Elementary that morning, his teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, initially assumed he was simply running late or perhaps staying home sick. It wasn't until the afternoon attendance check that she realized Danny had been marked absent all day without any notification from his parents. Following school protocol, she called the Patterson home around 3:30 p.m., expecting to reach Linda with a routine inquiry about Danny's absence. Linda's confusion quickly turned to panic when she realized Danny had left for school that morning as planned, but had never arrived. She immediately called Frank at work, her voice trembling as she explained the situation. Frank left his shift early and raced home, stopping at every house along Danny's usual route to school, asking neighbors if they had seen their son that morning. The responses were uniformly the same. No one remembered seeing Danny after he'd turned the corner off Maple Street. By 6 p.m., with still no sign of Danny, the Pattersons called the Columbus Police Department. Officer Janet Chen arrived within 20 minutes, beginning what would become one of the most extensive missing child investigations in the city's history. Chen took detailed notes about Danny's appearance, his usual routines, and any potential concerns the family might have had about strangers in the neighborhood or unusual incidents in recent weeks. The initial police response was swift and comprehensive. Within hours, patrol cars were canvassing the entire Clintonville area, officers were interviewing neighbors door to door, and Detective Ray Morrison had been assigned as the lead investigator on the case. Morrison was a 20-year veteran of the force, with extensive experience in missing persons cases, and he immediately recognized the urgency of the situation, given Danny's young age, and the complete absence of any logical explanation for his disappearance. The first 48 hours of the search were intense and exhausting. Linda and Frank barely slept, instead spending their time coordinating with police, organizing neighborhood search parties, and fielding phone calls from concerned friends and family members. The local news stations picked up the story immediately, broadcasting Danny's photograph and description across central Ohio. His image, a school portrait showing his bright smile and freckled face, became familiar to thousands of viewers who had never met the Patterson family but felt compelled to help. Search teams organized by the police department and volunteers from the community methodically combed through Alum Creek Park, the sprawling green space that bordered their neighborhood. Divers searched the deeper sections of the creek, while ground teams checked every trail, picnic area, and wooded section, where a small child might have wandered or been taken. The Ohio State University campus, just a few miles south of Clintonville, also became a focus area when investigators considered the possibility that Danny might have become confused and walked in the wrong direction. Detective Morrison's investigation quickly revealed several disturbing possibilities. A registered sex offender named Carl Hendricks had been released from prison just 6 months earlier and was living in a halfway house 15 miles from the Patterson home. Hendricks had a history of crimes against children and had violated his parole requirements by failing to report to his assigned officer for the past 3 weeks. When police attempted to locate him for questioning, they discovered he had abandoned the halfway house and his current whereabouts were unknown. The search for Hendricks became a parallel investigation that consumed significant resources. Police departments across Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia were alerted to be on the lookout for both Hendricks and Danny. The FBI became involved when the case crossed state lines, bringing additional expertise and resources to bear on what was becoming an increasingly complex investigation. Special Agent Patricia Hayes was assigned as the federal liaison, and her experience with interstate kidnapping cases proved invaluable in coordinating the multi-jurisdictional effort. Meanwhile, the emotional toll on the Patterson family was devastating. Linda stopped eating regularly and developed chronic insomnia, spending her nights walking through Danny's bedroom and touching his belongings as if trying to maintain some connection with her missing son. Frank struggled to maintain his composure at work, often breaking down in the plant's break room when well-meaning co-workers asked about the investigation's progress. Their marriage, which had been strong and supportive, began showing signs of strain under the enormous pressure. The community response was overwhelming in its scope and generosity. Local businesses donated money for reward funds and printing costs for missing person flyers. Churches organized prayer vigils and volunteer coordination efforts. The local Kroger supermarket allowed the Pattersons to set up information tables in their entrance, where hundreds of customers stopped daily to take flyers and ask how they could help with the search efforts. As weeks turned into months, the investigation expanded to include psychics, private investigators hired by concerned community members, and specialized search teams with cadaver dogs. Every lead, no matter how unlikely, was followed up with meticulous attention to detail. A reported sighting of Danny at a rest stop in Kentucky prompted a 3-day search effort involving dozens of law enforcement officers. A tip about a child matching Danny's description being seen at a carnival in West Virginia led to interviews with every carnival worker and a thorough search of all vehicles and equipment. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts painted a troubling picture of Danny's likely captor. Based on the circumstances of his disappearance and similar cases, they believed he had been taken by someone who had been watching him and planning the abduction. The profile suggested the perpetrator was likely a white male between the ages of 25 and 45, probably someone who lived alone and had limited social connections, possibly someone who worked in a job that required him to travel or gave him flexibility in his schedule. During the first year of Danny's disappearance, the Patterson family received hundreds of phone calls from people claiming to have information. Most were well-intentioned, but ultimately unhelpful. People who thought they had seen Danny at shopping malls, parks, or other public places, but whose descriptions didn't match or whose timing made their sightings impossible. Some calls were from cruel individuals who took pleasure in giving false hope to desperate parents, requiring Detective Morrison to spend valuable time investigating claims that proved to be hoaxes or attempts at extortion. The financial strain of the search became significant as the Pattersons exhausted their savings on private investigators, reward money, and travel expenses to follow up on distant leads. Linda had taken unpaid leave from her substitute teaching job to dedicate herself full-time to the search, while Frank worked overtime whenever possible to compensate for their reduced household income. Friends and family members helped with expenses when they could, but the costs of maintaining such an extensive search effort were substantial. By the second anniversary of Danny's disappearance, the case had received national attention through appearances on television shows dedicated to missing children and unsolved crimes. The Patterson family traveled to television studios in New York and Los Angeles, sharing their story with audiences across the country and hoping that someone, somewhere, might recognize their son or have information about his whereabouts. These appearances were emotionally draining, but represented their best hope of reaching people who might not have seen the local news coverage. The investigation had generated thousands of pages of reports, hundreds of photographs, and detailed timelines of every potential lead and sighting. Detective Morrison had interviewed over 300 people directly connected to the case and coordinated with law enforcement agencies in 17 states. Despite this massive effort, no concrete evidence had emerged to definitively explain what had happened to Danny or to identify who might have been responsible for his disappearance. As the investigation continued into its third year, the psychological toll on everyone involved became increasingly apparent. Linda had lost 30 pounds and developed anxiety attacks that required medication to manage. Frank's blood pressure had risen to dangerous levels, and his doctor had warned him about the health consequences of chronic stress. Detective Morrison, who had become emotionally invested in the case to an unusual degree, was also showing signs of burnout and had requested additional support from his department. The turning point came in late 1989 when the trail on Carl Hendricks finally went completely cold. Despite extensive efforts by multiple law enforcement agencies, he had seemingly vanished as completely as Danny had. The FBI's behavioral analysts suggested that Hendricks had either left the country, assumed a completely new identity, or had died, possibly by suicide, after committing his crime. Without any concrete evidence linking him to Danny's disappearance, however, the case remained officially unsolved. The decision to scale back the active investigation was agonizing for everyone involved. Detective Morrison fought to keep the case active, arguing that new leads were still coming in regularly and that advancing technology might eventually provide breakthrough opportunities. However, departmental resources were limited and other cases demanded attention. The compromise reached was that Danny's case would remain open but would no longer receive dedicated daily attention unless new, substantial evidence emerged. For the Patterson family, this transition represented a kind of death, not of hope, exactly, but of the intensive daily focus that had defined their lives for nearly 4 years. Linda gradually began to accept that she needed to find ways to function in the world again, even while maintaining hope that Danny would someday return. She began seeing a therapist who specialized in helping families cope with ambiguous loss, the unique grief that comes from not knowing whether a loved one is alive or dead. The process of learning to live with uncertainty while maintaining hope proved to be one of the most difficult challenges the Pattersons had ever faced. Linda started volunteering at a local literacy program, finding some measure of purpose in helping children learn to read. Frank became involved with support groups for families of missing children, discovering that sharing his experience with other parents in similar situations provided both comfort and practical guidance. They moved from their Clintonville home in 1991, unable to continue living in the place where they had last seen Danny safely. Their new house across town was smaller and more affordable, but it represented a fresh start and an acknowledgement that they needed to build a life that didn't revolve entirely around their son's absence. They kept Danny's belongings in storage, unable to dispose of them, but also unable to maintain his bedroom as a shrine indefinitely. The 1990s brought gradual healing alongside persistent grief. Linda returned to substitute teaching, finding that working with children brought both joy and pain, but ultimately felt meaningful. Frank was promoted to a supervisory position at the plant, and the additional responsibilities helped occupy his mind during difficult periods. They learned to celebrate Danny's birthday each year with a private ceremony at home, lighting candles and sharing memories while acknowledging the passage of time and their son's continued absence. The couple's relationship with law enforcement evolved over the years as well. Detective Morrison retired in 1995, but maintained occasional contact with the family, checking in around anniversaries and holidays to see how they were coping. His replacement, Detective Michael Torres, reviewed the case file thoroughly and assured the Pattersons that any new leads would be investigated promptly. But the reality was that few substantial tips continued to come in as the case faded from public memory. Technological advances in the late 1990s and early 2000s brought new possibilities for missing children cases. DNA databases, improved fingerprint analysis, and computer networks that could quickly share information across jurisdictions offered hope that cold cases might eventually be solved. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children maintained Danny's case in their databases, and his age-progressed photographs were updated periodically to show how he might look as he grew older. By 2005, Danny would have been 27 years old. Linda sometimes found herself studying the faces of young men she encountered, customers at the grocery store, students on the Ohio State campus, workers at local businesses, wondering if she might somehow recognize her son in the features of a stranger. These moments brought both hope and heartache, reminding her that Danny was no longer the 8-year-old boy who had disappeared, but would be a fully grown adult with his own life experiences and relationships. The couple had made peace with the probability that they would never know what had happened to their son, but they had never officially declared him dead or held a funeral service. Some family members and friends had suggested that doing so might provide closure and allow them to move forward more completely, but Linda and Frank couldn't bring themselves to take that final step. As long as Danny's fate remained unknown, some small part of them maintained hope that he might still be alive somewhere. Their daily routine in 2010 had settled into a comfortable rhythm that honored Danny's memory, while allowing them to function and find meaning in their lives. Linda had become the head librarian at the local branch, where she particularly enjoyed working with children and teenagers on their reading and research projects. Frank had developed a hobby of woodworking, creating furniture and decorative items that he donated to local charities. They had learned to speak about Danny naturally in conversation, sharing happy memories without being overwhelmed by grief every time his name was mentioned. The support network they had built over the years included other families who had experienced similar losses, friends from their church community, and colleagues who understood their journey and provided ongoing emotional support. They had also become informal counselors for newly affected families, offering practical advice about dealing with law enforcement, media attention, and the complex emotions that accompany a missing child case. Neither Linda nor Frank was prepared for what happened on that humid Thursday evening in July 2010, when their carefully reconstructed life was turned upside down once again. They had just finished dinner and were settling in to watch the evening news when their doorbell rang at exactly 6:47 p.m. Frank had been reading the newspaper while Linda loaded the dishwasher, and neither of them was expecting visitors or deliveries. Frank opened the front door to find a tall, thin man in his 30s standing on their porch. The stranger had sandy brown hair that was darker than Danny's had been as a child, with a receding hairline that made him look older than his years. His clothes were neat but inexpensive, jeans and a plain button-down shirt that suggested he worked in manual labor. Most striking, however, were the constellation of freckles across his nose and the unmistakable shape of his eyes, which were exactly the same shade of brown that Linda used to look into every morning when she woke Danny up for school. "Hello, Mom and Dad," the man said quietly, his voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. "It's me, it's Danny. I've come home." The words hit Frank like a physical blow, causing him to grip the doorframe for support as his knees threatened to buckle. Linda, hearing the stranger's voice from the kitchen, came to the door and immediately dropped the dish towel she had been holding. The three of them stood frozen for several long moments, none of them quite believing that this impossible moment was actually happening. "Danny!" Linda whispered, her voice barely audible as she studied the man's face, searching for traces of the child she had lost 24 years earlier. "Is it really you? How is this possible?" The man nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks as he struggled to find words adequate for such an extraordinary moment. "I know how impossible this must seem. I know how much time has passed. But it's really me, Mom. I've been trying to work up the courage to come here for months." Frank's protective instincts warred with his desperate desire to believe that this was truly his son. The rational part of his mind insisted that this had to be some kind of cruel hoax or case of mistaken identity, while his heart recognized something indefinably familiar in the stranger's mannerisms and speech patterns. "We need proof," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We need to be absolutely certain. This is too important to get wrong." Danny understood their caution completely and had prepared for this moment during the long months leading up to his decision to return home. He rolled up his left sleeve to reveal a small crescent-shaped scar on his forearm, the result of falling off his bicycle in their driveway when he was 6 years old and catching his arm on the metal edge of Frank's toolbox. He described the layout of their old house in detail, including the loose floorboard in his bedroom that creaked when you stepped on it, the way the bathroom door stuck unless you lifted it slightly while turning the handle, and the secret hiding place behind the water heater where he had kept his candy stash away from his parents' watchful eyes. "I remember that you used to call me kiddo when I did something that made you proud," Danny continued, looking directly at Frank. "And Mom, you always made chocolate chip pancakes on Sunday mornings, and you would let me help measure the ingredients, even though I usually spilled flour everywhere. You used to read me stories about superheroes before bed, and you would do different voices for all the characters." Linda sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the flood of memories that each detail triggered. These weren't facts that could have been gleaned from police reports or newspaper articles about Danny's disappearance. These were the intimate details of daily family life, the small moments and private jokes that had comprised the childhood that had been stolen from all of them so many years earlier. As the initial shock began to wear off, the questions came in a torrent. Where had Danny been all these years? Who had taken him? How had he survived? Why had he waited so long to come home? The answers Danny provided were both heartbreaking and infuriating, revealing a story of captivity, manipulation, and gradual psychological conditioning that had kept him away from his family for more than 2 decades. Carl Hendricks, the registered sex offender who had been the prime suspect in Danny's disappearance, had indeed been responsible for the kidnapping. He had approached Danny that October morning in 1986, wearing coveralls and carrying a clipboard, posing as a utility worker who needed to check the gas lines at the Patterson house. When Danny had trustingly approached to see what the man needed, Hendricks had told him there was an emergency at home and that his parents had sent him to bring Danny back immediately. The 8-year-old Danny, polite and obedient as his parents had raised him to be, had gotten into Hendricks' blue sedan without question. By the time he realized something was wrong, they were already miles away from Columbus, driving south on back roads toward a remote farm property in rural Kentucky that Hendricks had inherited from his deceased father. The property where Danny had been held consisted of a run-down farmhouse and several outbuildings on 47 acres of isolated land, miles from the nearest neighbor and accessible only by a long gravel road that wound through dense woods. Hendricks had prepared the location carefully, installing locks on the outside of bedroom doors and boarding up windows to prevent escape attempts. He had stockpiled food, medical supplies, and educational materials, suggesting that Danny's kidnapping had been planned well in advance. Hendricks had told Danny that his parents had been killed in a car accident while searching for him, and that he was now Danny's legal guardian. The 8-year-old, traumatized and confused, had initially refused to believe this story, but Hendricks had been patient and persistent in his manipulation. He showed Danny fake newspaper clippings about the supposed accident and gradually convinced him that his old life was gone forever and that his only choice was to accept his new circumstances. The isolation was nearly complete. Hendricks homeschooled Danny using outdated textbooks and religious materials, teaching him basic academic subjects, but also indoctrinating him with paranoid beliefs about the outside world. He convinced Danny that the government and law enforcement were corrupt and dangerous, that cities were full of violence and crime, and that their rural sanctuary was the only safe place in an increasingly hostile world. As Danny grew older and stronger, he had made several escape attempts, but the property's remote location made success nearly impossible. The nearest town was over 15 miles away through difficult terrain, and Hendricks had trained Danny to believe that even if he did manage to reach civilization, no one would believe his story or help him. The few times Danny had made it off the property, he had been found by Hendricks within hours and subjected to severe punishments that discouraged further attempts. The psychological control was as effective as the physical isolation. Hendricks had convinced Danny that he was protecting him from a world that had forgotten about him and wouldn't want him back. He showed Danny missing person reports from newspapers, pointing out how quickly other missing children cases faded from public attention, and suggested that Danny's own family had probably moved on and started new lives without him. The years passed slowly in this artificial bubble. Danny learned practical skills like farming, basic carpentry, and mechanical repair, but he missed out entirely on normal social development. He had no contact with other children, no exposure to popular culture, and no understanding of how the outside world had changed during his captivity. His education was limited and filtered through Hendricks' paranoid worldview, leaving him with significant gaps in knowledge that would later make his reintegration into society extremely challenging. It wasn't until Hendricks suffered a massive heart attack in November 2009 that Danny's captivity finally ended. He found Hendricks collapsed in the farmhouse kitchen one morning, and despite years of complicated feelings toward his captor, tried to revive him and seek help. However, the nearest hospital was too far away, and Hendricks died before Danny could get him medical attention. For the first time in over 23 years, Danny was completely alone and free to make his own choices. However, the psychological conditioning he had endured made the transition to freedom anything but simple. He spent several weeks on the farm, paralyzed by uncertainty and afraid to leave the only home he remembered. The outside world that Hendricks had taught him to fear seemed vast and threatening, and he wasn't sure he had the skills or courage to navigate it successfully. Eventually, practical necessity forced him to venture into the nearest town for supplies. These initial forays were terrifying, but gradually became easier as Danny realized that the world wasn't as dangerous as Hendricks had led him to believe. He got a job doing manual labor for a local contractor, earning enough money to rent a small apartment and begin the slow process of learning how to function as an independent adult. The decision to return to Ohio and contact his family had been agonizing and complicated. Danny had spent months researching what had happened to his parents after his disappearance, using public computers at the local library to search for information about their current lives. He discovered that they were still alive, still married, and still living in the Columbus area. But he also learned about the massive search effort they had conducted and the emotional toll his disappearance had taken on their lives. Part of Danny was terrified that his parents wouldn't want him back after so many years, or that they wouldn't believe his story about what had happened to him. Another part worried that his return would reopen old wounds and disrupt the life they had managed to build in his absence. He had spent countless hours drafting and redrafting letters that he never sent, rehearsing phone conversations that he never made, and walking past their house several times without working up the courage to knock on the door. The reunion was overwhelming for everyone involved, filled with tears, disbelief, and a complex mixture of joy and grief for all the lost years. Linda and Frank struggled to reconcile the adult stranger standing in their living room with the 8-year-old child they had been searching for, while Danny grappled with emotions he had suppressed for decades and tried to reconnect with parents who were no longer the young adults he remembered from his childhood. The practical challenges of Danny's return were as complex as the emotional ones. He had no official identification beyond his birth certificate, no Social Security earnings history, no credit record, and no formal education credentials. The Social Security Administration had to reactivate his number, which had been flagged as belonging to a missing person for over 2 decades. Getting a driver's license, finding employment, and accessing basic services all required extensive documentation and bureaucratic navigation that was complicated by his unique circumstances. The FBI reopened Danny's case immediately, and their investigation of the Kentucky farm property confirmed many details of his account. They found evidence of Danny's long-term presence at the location, including personal items, educational materials, and modifications to the buildings that supported his description of his captivity. Hendrick's body was exhumed for autopsy, and investigators were able to definitively confirm his identity and link him to Danny's original disappearance through physical evidence found at the farm. The media attention that followed Danny's return was intense and overwhelming. News organizations from across the country wanted to interview the family and tell their remarkable story of loss and reunion. While the Pattersons appreciated the public interest and hoped their experience might help other families in similar situations, they also struggled with the intrusion into their privacy during such a sensitive and emotional time. Danny's adjustment to modern life was particularly challenging. The world had changed dramatically during his 24-year absence, and technologies that others took for granted, cell phones, the internet, electronic banking, were completely foreign to him. Simple social interactions were difficult after years of isolation, and he struggled with anxiety in crowded places or unfamiliar situations. Family therapy became essential as Linda, Frank, and Danny worked to build new relationships with each other while processing the trauma and loss they had all experienced. The 8-year-old Danny that his parents remembered was gone forever, and the adult Danny had been shaped by experiences that were difficult for anyone to understand. They had to learn to love and accept each other as they were now, rather than trying to recapture what had been lost. The healing process was gradual and ongoing. Danny eventually earned his GED and found steady work with a landscaping company, discovering that he enjoyed outdoor physical labor and had a natural talent for working with plants and design. Linda and Frank learned to celebrate small victories: Danny's first successful job interview, his first time driving alone, his first friendship with a co-worker who knew nothing about his past. While the Patterson family could never recover the lost decades or erase the trauma that had shaped all of their lives, they found ways to build something meaningful together. Their story became a testament to the enduring power of hope and love, proving that even in the face of unimaginable loss, families can find ways to heal and reconnect. Danny's return didn't erase the pain of those 24 years, but it gave them the opportunity to write a different ending to their story than anyone had ever dared to hope for.